Stop scrolling right now, because what NOAA's Weather Prediction Center just published in their Tuesday afternoon forecast discussion should make every American from Texas to Maine immediately revise their late January plans. Quote, "The core of this trough will deepen most impressively to reach the Gulf Coast Thursday afternoon, with NAF's 500 millibar heights below the first percentile within the CFSR climatology." For those who don't speak meteorologist, that single sentence means atmospheric conditions this week are forecast to achieve statistical depths not seen in the entire climate database. Below the first percentile, that's not unprecedented. Here's a number that should immediately grab your attention and explain why the phrase, unlike anything this decade, isn't hyperbole, but scientific assessment. On Tuesday, January 13th, 2026, at 2:51 p.m. Eastern Time, NOAA's Weather Prediction Center issued an extended forecast discussion describing atmospheric trough depth that will fall below the first percentile within the CFSR climatology. The Climate Forecast System Reanalysis climatology represents decades of atmospheric data going back to 1979, when current forecasts show conditions below the first percentile of that entire historical data set. You're not experiencing normal winter variability. You're experiencing atmospheric extremes that occur perhaps once every several years under typical conditions, except these aren't typical conditions because they're occurring against a background climate that's fundamentally different from when those historical records were established. Let me be absolutely clear about what makes this developing pattern genuinely unprecedented compared to every major winter storm the United States has experienced since 2020. It's not just one extreme weather event. It's the collision of multiple atmospheric forces happening simultaneously with a timing and intensity that hasn't occurred in modern meteorological memory. On January 7, 2026, Houston hit 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Less than 3 weeks later, current long-range forecasts show the same atmospheric pattern that produced that record. Warmth will reverse catastrophically, opening the door for what AccuWeather's lead long-range meteorologist Paul Pastelok calls, quote, "significant cold air to sweep into Texas and the Gulf Coast," end quote. This isn't gradual seasonal cooling. This is weather whiplash on a continental scale driven by polar vortex dynamics that are behaving in ways that fall outside the box of what current forecasting paradigms were designed to handle. Here's the timeline of transformation that demonstrates why comparing this to anything we've seen this decade reveals how much more extreme current atmospheric behavior has become. January 13th and 16, 2024, the benchmark storm, that system, which meteorologists and the media extensively covered at the time, brought heavy snowfall and ice to areas that rarely see winter weather. The Pacific Northwest experienced 80-mile-per-hour winds in the Columbia River Gorge. Texas, Louisiana, and Florida received wintry precipitation unusual for those regions. By the time the storm exited into Canada, 335,000 flights had been delayed across the 3-day period, with 8,600 complete cancellations. Copenhagen, New York recorded 40 inches of snow in just 27 hours. For context, that event was considered a major disruptive winter storm that affected tens of millions of Americans and caused billions in economic damage. Now fast forward to late December 2025 and early January 2026, and the atmospheric pattern is already exceeding multiple metrics from that 2024 benchmark. December 29th through January 6th, 2026, back-to-back bomb cyclones, systems where central pressure drops at least 24 millibars in 24 hours, hammered the Midwest and Northeast. The first system brought blizzard conditions to Michigan's Upper Peninsula with snowfall measured in feet, not inches. Wind gusts exceeded 60 miles per hour across portions of the Great Lakes. Over 114 million Americans found themselves under high wind alerts as Arctic air plunged southward behind the system. Just 3 days later, before communities had fully recovered, a second bomb cyclone developed, bringing another round of heavy snow, dangerous ice accumulation, and powerful winds affecting the same regions. Marquette, Michigan's Upper Peninsula saw accumulations between 15 and 24 inches from the second storm alone, with some locations receiving up to 60-mile-per-hour wind gusts near Lake Superior. The Keweenaw Peninsula, jutting into Lake Superior north of Houghton, experience forecast winds up to 65 miles per hour, the highest predicted for the entire event, making travel, quote, very difficult to impossible, end quote, according to National Weather Service warnings. Meanwhile, Buffalo and Syracuse, cities that pride themselves on handling winter weather, faced blizzard warnings for up to 2 feet of additional snow on top of what had already fallen. The eastern Lake Ontario region received similar warnings extending through an entire week, with continuous lake-effect snow producing whiteout conditions and massive accumulations. But here's where this story diverges from a typical active winter pattern and enters territory that justifies the phrase, unlike anything this decade. While the Midwest and Northeast dealt with back-to-back bomb cyclones, the South experienced the warmest early January temperatures in modern record. January 7th, Houston, 82 degrees. Tulsa, 74 degrees. Baton Rouge, 81 degrees. 31 weather observation stations across the Rio Grande Valley either set records or came within tenths of a degree of breaking records that had stood for decades. South Texas residents in January turned on their air conditioners because temperatures were running 20 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. This simultaneous occurrence of extreme cold producing historic snowfall in the north, while extreme heat shattered records in the south, represents atmospheric behavior that climate scientists have been warning about for years, but that many people still struggle to accept as the new normal. The jet stream, that river of high-altitude wind that separates cold polar air from warm tropical air, has developed such extreme waves and kinks that regions just a few hundred miles apart experience completely different climate zones. When the jet stream buckles this dramatically, it doesn't gradually transition from warm to cold over weeks. It flips like a light switch, producing temperature swings of 50 to 60 degrees in 72 hours, creating conditions that infrastructure, emergency services, and human planning simply cannot accommodate. Now let me explain the atmospheric physics behind why late January through early February 2026 represents the culmination of this pattern, and why forecasters are using language they reserve for genuinely alarming situations. The stratospheric sudden warming event that began in mid-December 2025, earlier than typical and stronger than historical precedent, has been propagating downward through the atmospheric column for 3 weeks. This downward coupling process, where disruptions in the stratosphere 12 miles above Earth's surface gradually affect surface weather patterns, reaches its maximum intensity typically 2 to 6 weeks after the initial stratospheric warming. We're now entering that maximum intensity window in mid to late January 2026. Current ensemble forecasts from multiple independent modeling systems show the polar vortex core, that massive circulation of Arctic air that normally stays confined above the North Pole, being displaced into North America by late January. When this happens, the source region for Arctic air shifts from its usual position over the polar ocean to positions over central and eastern Canada. This matters because air masses that originate over frozen ocean and ice sheets are significantly colder than air masses that would normally affect the United States in midwinter. We're not talking about typical January cold. We're talking about temperatures and wind chills that approach or match the most extreme cold snaps of the past 20 to 30 years, occurring across a much broader geographic area than those historical events affected. AccuWeather's long-range forecasting team, which has been tracking this pattern evolution for months, published analysis stating that late January to early February represents, quote, the highest potential for the polar vortex to shift south, unleashing some of the coldest air of the season across North America, end quote. This isn't speculation or sensationalism. This is the assessment of professional meteorologists who stake their reputation on seasonal forecasts, telling you that the atmospheric configuration developing right now has the potential to produce cold air outbreaks that exceed anything experienced so far this winter, and potentially anything experienced in the last several years. For those of you over 30 who remember winters that progressed predictably from mild cold in November to peak cold in January and February, then gradual warming into March, this pattern represents something fundamentally different. We're experiencing a winter where early January produced spring-like warmth in Texas, while late January forecasts show potential for record-breaking cold. The temperature progression isn't gradual, It's chaotic. Forecast models that normally agree on broad patterns 7 to 10 days out are showing significant disagreement about the exact timing and intensity of these Arctic outbreaks, indicating atmospheric chaos that exceeds the model's ability to resolve beyond 5 to 6 days. Here's what the data tells us about how this late January pattern compares to major winter events of the past decade using multiple objective metrics. Metric 1. Atmospheric trough depth. Tuesday's NOAA forecast discussion describes the trough reaching the Gulf Coast with 500 millibar heights below the first percentile of the CFSR climatology. In statistical terms, this means conditions are forecast to be more extreme than 99% of all historical observations in the database. When atmospheric scientists see forecasts this far outside normal variability, they pay attention because these are the setups that produce weather events that get written about in meteorology journals and climate assessments. Metric 2. Temperature departures from climatological averages. Current extended forecasts show potential for temperatures 30 to 40 degrees below normal across portions of Texas and the Gulf Coast during the late January Arctic outbreak. These aren't brief cold snaps lasting 24 to 48 hours. Ensemble guidance suggests this cold pattern could persist for 7 to 10 days or longer, creating sustained extreme conditions that stress every system from power grids to water infrastructure to agricultural operations. The economic impact of week-long extreme cold across the southern tier of the United States, regions where infrastructure isn't designed for sustained freezing temperatures, could exceed the impacts of the February 2021 Texas freeze that killed hundreds and caused tens of billions in damage. Metric 3. Geographic extent of impacts. The 2024 January storm primarily affected specific corridors: Pacific Northwest, southern states with unusual winter weather, and the Northeast. Current forecasts for late January 2026 show potential impacts affecting every region of the continental United States simultaneously. The West faces continued atmospheric river events that could produce flooding. The Midwest and Great Lakes face repeated clipper systems bringing frequent snow and bitter cold. The South faces the Arctic outbreak I have described. The Northeast faces potential nor'easter development if the Arctic air interacts with coastal moisture. When meteorologists talk about pattern changes that affect the entire nation at once, that's a signal of atmospheric forcing on a scale that creates weather history. Now let me reveal the specific dates between January 21st and February 2nd when this unprecedented pattern reaches peak intensity and which regions face the most dangerous conditions. January 21st through 24th, the pattern transition begins. The Old Farmer's Almanac, which uses proprietary long-range forecasting methods that have shown reasonable skill over decades, predicts this as the beginning of a stormy period for the heartland states of Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. Their forecast calls for the period starting with the snowstorm before shifting to sunnier but increasingly frigid weather. The Ohio Valley, encompassing portions of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, and West Virginia, is forecast to see a cooler, sunny stretch January 21st through 24th before a mix of snow and rain arrives January 25th through 26th. This pattern signature, where initial snowfall is followed by clearing but intensifying cold, matches perfectly with the atmospheric evolution that ensemble models are showing. The initial storm systems bring precipitation and cloud cover. As those systems move offshore, clearing skies allow radiational cooling to intensify the cold air mass. Meanwhile, continued northerly flow keeps importing fresh Arctic air, preventing any moderation. This is the recipe for dangerous cold that persists rather than moderate after a few days. January 25th through 28th. Arctic outbreak reaches maximum intensity. This is when current forecasts show the displaced polar vortex core in position to deliver the coldest air of the season to a swath of the United States from the Dakotas through the Great Lakes and potentially as far south as the Gulf Coast. Sub-zero actual air temperatures, not wind chill, are forecast across Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, and South Dakota. The Dakotas could experience temperatures approaching 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit in the coldest locations, with wind chills dropping to 40 to 50 degrees. At those wind chills, exposed skin freezes in under 10 minutes. Outdoor activity becomes life-threatening for all but the most prepared individuals with proper cold weather gear. Farther south, temperatures that would normally bottom out in the teens to low 20s during typical January cold snaps could drop into single digits or even below zero in portions of the Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic, Kansas and Oklahoma, states where winter cold is expected but extreme cold is rare, face forecasts showing consistent lows in the 20s to 30s Fahrenheit, 15 to 25 degrees below normal for late January. This may not sound extreme compared to what the northern states face, but remember that infrastructure, agriculture, and human behavior in these regions aren't adapted for sustained, hard freezes. Water pipes burst, livestock suffer, heating systems struggle, economic activity slows dramatically. For Texas and the Gulf Coast, this represents the critical window where the pattern shift AccuWeather described as opening the door for significant cold air materializes. Current ensemble guidance shows increasing probability of temperatures dropping into the 20s and potentially teens across northern Texas, with even the Houston metro area facing potential for temperatures in the low to mid-30s for sustained periods. After experiencing 80-degree weather just 2 weeks earlier, the temperature whiplash creates cascading failures across every system that depends on stable environmental conditions. January 29th through February 2nd, the sustained impact period. Even after the initial Arctic blast peaks, current forecasts show the cold pattern maintaining itself rather than quickly moderating. This persistence matters enormously because it's the difference between a brief, inconvenient cold snap and a genuine emergency that overwhelms response capabilities. The Old Farmer's Almanac forecast for multiple regions calls for the end of January to remain cold with various forms of precipitation. The Southeast, including the Carolinas and Georgia, is predicted to see rain at times from January 25th through 29th, while conditions turn very cold. The Northeast faces cold conditions with flurries mainly in western areas from January 27th through 31st. This geographic distribution, where virtually every region from coast to coast experiences some form of winter weather impact during the same week-long period, represents the signature of a pattern that's fundamentally different from typical winter variability. Normal winters feature regional weather events that affect portions of the country, while others experience calm conditions. This late January pattern shows potential for simultaneous impacts across the entire continental United States, stretching emergency response resources, disrupting transportation networks, and creating compound disasters where one region's emergency prevents it from assisting neighboring regions facing their own crises. Now let me address what this unprecedented pattern means for your daily life, your family's safety, and your community's resilience during what could be the most dangerous 2 weeks of winter 2026. The preparation window is closing rapidly. If you're in the projected impact zone, which based on current forecasts includes virtually every American except possibly extreme southern Florida and Hawaii, you have approximately 1 week to complete preparations before conditions begin deteriorating. This isn't theoretical planning for a storm that might happen. This is preparing for atmospheric conditions that multiple independent forecasting systems are showing with increasing confidence. For those in the northern tier states from Montana through Minnesota and Wisconsin to New England, your preparation focuses on extreme cold management. Can your home maintain livable temperatures if you lose power for 3 to 5 days when it's 20 degrees outside? Do you have backup heating that doesn't depend on electricity or natural gas? The February 2021 Texas freeze demonstrated catastrophically that when extreme cold coincides with power grid stress, millions can lose heat simultaneously. Northern states have more cold weather infrastructure, but that infrastructure isn't designed for the magnitude of cold that displaced polar vortex events can produce. Stock emergency supplies now. 2 weeks of non-perishable food, 1 gallon of water per person per day, full prescriptions for all medications, alternative heat sources with proper ventilation, flashlights, batteries, hand crank or battery-powered radios, and first aid supplies. Insulate vulnerable Water pipes. Know where your main water shutoff is and how to use it. If pipes freeze and burst while you're away or asleep, thousands of gallons can flood your home in hours. Prepare vehicles with full winter emergency kits, including blankets, food, water, and supplies to survive overnight if stranded. The difference between inconvenience and tragedy often comes down to having basic supplies immediately available when conditions deteriorate faster than help can arrive. For those in the southern tier from Texas through the Gulf Coast and Southeast, your preparation focuses on infrastructure protection and rapid cold adaptation. Your pipes aren't buried as deep. Your homes aren't insulated for extreme cold. Your heating systems aren't sized for sustained hard freezes. When temperatures drop into the 20s and teens for extended periods, systems that handle typical winter weather fail catastrophically. Protect outdoor plumbing. Bring sensitive plants indoors or cover them. Ensure adequate heating fuel supply because demand will spike beyond normal. Consider preemptive pipe drip to prevent freeze damage. Stock supplies to shelter in place because southern states' snow and ice response capabilities are limited compared to northern states, and even minor accumulations can shut down transportation. The economic implications of this late January pattern extend beyond immediate weather impacts into long-term consequences that will affect prices, availability, and economic activity for months. Agricultural operations face potentially catastrophic losses if the Arctic outbreak reaches the Gulf Coast, with the intensity current forecasts done suggest. Winter vegetable crops in Texas and Florida could suffer extensive freeze damage. Citrus groves face risk of fruit loss and tree damage. Livestock operations must manage animals through temperature extremes their facilities weren't designed to handle. These agricultural disruptions cascade through food supply chains, affecting prices and availability nationwide through the spring and summer growing season. Energy markets will experience extreme volatility as natural gas and heating oil demand spikes across regions simultaneously. The 2021 Texas freeze saw natural gas prices temporarily spike to levels 100 times normal as demand overwhelmed supply infrastructure. While the industry has made some improvements since then, the potential for late January 2026 cold to affect a broader geographic area for a longer duration creates risk of similar price shocks. Electricity grids will face maximum stress as heating demand peaks while solar generation diminishes under cloud cover and snow, and wind generation drops when turbines ice up or shut down in extreme cold. Transportation and logistics face disruptions that affect every sector of the economy. Airlines will cancel thousands of flights as airports in affected regions shut down or reduce capacity. The 2H24 storm saw 335,000 flight delays and 8,600 cancellations over 3 days. A week-long extreme cold and winter storm event affecting the entire eastern half of the United States could produce delays and cancellations an order of magnitude larger. Trucking networks will slow dramatically as drivers face ice-covered highways, reduced visibility in snow squalls, and extreme cold that causes mechanical failures. Supply chains operating on just-in-time delivery principles will break down as shipments that should take 2 days take 5 or 6. Retail businesses face the challenge of stocking for demand patterns that don't match normal seasonal progressions. Stores that reduced winter merchandise inventory during the early January warmth will face shortages when the cold arrives. Hardware stores that move snow removal equipment to clearance will scramble to restock as demand spikes. These inventory mismatches create frustration for consumers and lost revenue for businesses, while also indicating how poorly current economic systems are adapted to the kind of rapid weather transitions that climate change is making routine rather than exceptional. Insurance companies will face claim surges from burst pipes, storm damage, vehicle accidents on ice-covered roads, and business interruption as companies shut down during extreme weather. Each major winter event pushes premiums higher for all policyholders as insurers adjust risk models to account for increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather. Property values in regions repeatedly affected by these events will decline as buyers factor in the rising costs of insurance, emergency preparedness, and potential damage. This creates economic inequality where those with resources can afford to live in climate-resilient housing, while those without resources get priced into increasingly vulnerable situations. Municipal and state governments will strain budgets managing emergency response, snow removal, shelter operations, and infrastructure repairs. When extreme weather events occur with increasing frequency, the budget assumptions that governments use for planning become obsolete. A city that budgets for 2 or 3 major snow events per winter finds itself overwhelmed when 6 or 7 occur. A state that expects 1 extreme cold outbreak per decade faces fiscal crisis when they occur twice in 5 years. These budget pressures lead to higher taxes, reduced services, or deteriorating infrastructure as governments struggle to adapt to climate variability that exceeds historical planning assumptions. Here's something that receives insufficient attention in weather coverage, but profoundly affects how communities navigate these challenges. The psychological and social impact of repeated extreme weather creates fractures in social cohesion that make each successive event harder to manage. After the record January heat, people wanted to believe winter was over, that spring had arrived early, that they could put away heavy coats and enjoy mild weather. Being forced to shift mentally back into deep winter mode after that brief warmth creates cognitive dissonance and emotional exhaustion. When these jarring transitions happen repeatedly, people develop weather fatigue where they stop taking warnings seriously because the constant state of alertness becomes unsustainable. This creates dangerous situations where genuine life-threatening warnings get dismissed as more media hype because people have heard so many warnings that didn't materialize as catastrophically as predicted. Not because the forecasts were wrong, but because people prepared effectively and avoided the worst outcomes. Breaking through this fatigue to communicate genuine urgency without creating panic represents one of the most difficult challenges in modern meteorology and emergency management. For parents and caregivers, explaining these rapid changes to children while maintaining routine and stability becomes increasingly difficult. How do you help children understand that the weather can swing from short-sleeved days to dangerous cold in 2 weeks? How do you balance teaching appropriate caution about weather hazards while not creating anxiety about forces beyond anyone's control? These questions don't have easy answers, but they represent the daily reality of raising children in an era where atmospheric stability has been replaced by chronic chaos. The 3 most critical preparation steps you must take this week before the pattern transition accelerates are these. First, complete a comprehensive inventory of your cold weather emergency supplies and fill any gaps immediately. This isn't optional. This is survival preparation for conditions that could exceed anything you've experienced in the last decade. 2 weeks of food and water, backup heating, medical supplies, communication equipment, and transportation emergency kits. When the Arctic air arrives and systems start failing, stores will be mobbed or closed, roads will be impassable, and help may not be available for days. The time to prepare is now, while conditions allow safe movement and stores still have stock. Second, conduct a home weatherization walkthrough focused specifically on extreme cold vulnerabilities. Where are your water pipes located? Which ones are in exterior walls or unheated crawl spaces? Do you have heat tape or insulation for those vulnerable pipes? Can you identify and access your main water shutoff? Do you have adequate insulation in your attic to prevent ice dams when snow accumulates on your roof? These aren't theoretical concerns. These are the specific failure modes that create the pipe bursts, flooding, and structural damage that cost tens of thousands of dollars and months of repair after extreme cold events. Third, establish communication and mutual aid plans with family members, neighbors, and vulnerable community members. When power fails and cell towers go down, how will you check on elderly relatives? Do you know which neighbors have generators or medical equipment that requires electricity? Have you identified warm shelter alternatives if your primary heating fails? Community resilience during extreme weather depends on these social networks